A wealthy woman drove a man she loved down a road she had never shown anyone. It ended at an abandoned house sitting alone at the edge of a Kentucky field. Overgrown and forgotten. When he stepped inside, he found something. Something she had not told him was there. And what he chose to do with it in the next 60 seconds was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it told her everything about who he was, and it told her something worse about who she had become. Stay with me. What he did will make you question everything you think you know about men. In the small city of Harlan, Kentucky, there lived a woman named Cressida Vane. Cressida was 34 and ran a company her grandmother had built from nothing. Vane Agricultural Holdings. Farmland, grain storage, supply contracts across 3 counties. She wore plain clothes, drove a 5-year-old truck, and ate at the same diner every Wednesday. She had no interest in performing wealth. Everyone in Harlan knew what she was worth anyway. She had been in love before. The first time, the man left when the money slowed. He said things about timing. She nodded and let him go. The second time, 2 years in, she found out the man had been quietly speaking to her lawyers about estate arrangements. Not because they were engaged. Because he was planning. She ended it the same evening. She did not cry. She cleaned her kitchen and went to bed early. After that she told herself she was done. Not bitterly. Just quietly. She decided the company was enough and she believed that for almost 3 years. Then she met Arlo. Arlo Finch worked at a hardware supply warehouse on the edge of town. 37, lean, patient in a way people sometimes read as slow. He had moved to Harlan from a small town outside Pikeville after his father passed and left him a small debt and a box of old tools. He sold the tools, cleared the debt, and started over. He drove a truck older than Cressida's. He lived in a rented room above a laundromat on Clover Street. He always left a tip at Mays even when the service was slow. He had also, at some point in the last 2 years, learned to carry himself in a demure way inside certain buildings. Not stiff, not defensive. Just careful. Like a man who had been watched too many times in places that decided quickly he did not belong. Harlan was a small city, but it had its lines, and a man without money who stepped too close to a woman with a name like Vane found those lines quickly. He had stopped being surprised by it. He had simply learned to take up less room. Cressida met him by accident. She came into the warehouse for a replacement part for an irrigation pump. The part was wrong. The man at the counter was already wrapping it when Arlo walked past. "That's not going to fit a centrifugal pump," he said. Not to her. Just out loud. She looked at him. "You know irrigation equipment?" "I grew up on a farm," he said. That was the beginning. He found the right part. She came back the following week. Then again. And then she started coming back when she did not need anything at all, which she did not admit to herself for another month. Arlo did not treat her differently after he found out who she was. He asked about soil drainage, crop rotation, whether she had ever thought about switching her eastern fields. He talked to her the way someone talks to a person they find genuinely interesting. That was the part she could not get past. They had been seeing each other for 4 months when the question arrived. She pushed it away twice. It came back both times. How do I know? She had been fooled before. Both times by men who moved slowly, who knew how to seem like the right thing until enough time had passed that leaving became complicated. She knew how long a performance could hold. She thought about Arlo. The rented room. The warehouse job. He had nothing. She had everything. She could not stop asking whether that was the reason he stayed. She hated that she was asking for it. She had watched him in that warehouse for 4 months. She had eaten breakfast with him at Mays. She had seen him slip money into the collection jar at the counter without mentioning it. She had watched him with people who could do nothing for him and seen the same man she got when he was with her. And still she was asking. That was the thing that frightened her most. Not that he might be lying, but that her fear had grown so large it could no longer see past itself. So she made a decision. There was a house she had never shown anyone. It sat on a piece of land her grandmother had owned at the outer edge of Harlan County, past the last paved road, down a gravel track between 2 old fence lines. Empty for over 20 years. Her grandfather had died in the bedroom. Her grandmother closed the door that week and never went back. Nobody in the family could sell it, Nobody could fix it. So it sat there, slowly going back to the earth. The roof had patches of rot. The porch steps had collapsed on one side. The yard was overgrown, old vines climbing the south wall. Inside there was furniture under dust sheets, cracked plaster, the smell of a house that had been alone too long. She was not going to tell Arlo who owned it. She would say it was a company property needing assessment. She would bring him there and watch. Not for what he said. For what he did. The men who had wanted something from her always responded the same way to her properties. Their eyes would move over everything and total it up quietly. They talked about potential, about value, about what the right investment could do with a piece like this. They could not help themselves. Arlo would either do that or he would not. She drove out on a Saturday morning in October, the sky flat and gray over the hills. Arlo sat in the passenger seat with a travel mug. He asked where they were going. She said she needed another pair of eyes on something. He nodded and did not ask again. When the paved road ended and the gravel began, he looked out at the open fields. "Pretty out here," he said. She did not answer. The house appeared around a curve in the track. She stopped the engine. Arlo looked at it through the windshield without speaking. Then he got out. She got out on her side. He stood in front of the truck and looked at the collapsed porch step, the vines on the south wall, the windows gray with 20 years of weather. "How long has it been empty?" he asked. "Over 20 years, she said. He walked toward it. He found the side of the porch that had not collapsed and stepped up carefully. He tested the boards with his weight. Then he moved toward the door. Inside, the smell hit first. Dust and closed wood and old fabric and time. Arlo looked around the front room slowly. Settee under a gray sheet. A fireplace with an iron grate full of old ash. Wallpaper peeled from the upper corners in long strips. He did not say a word about value. He walked to the fireplace and crouched in front of it and looked at the grate for a moment. "Somebody loved this room," he said. Not to her. Just out loud. She stood near the door and watched him. He moved through the kitchen. The iron sink, the old wooden counters. At the window above the sink he stopped. "There was a garden back there once," he said. "You can still see the border stones." He looked at them for a moment. Then he moved into the hallway. He pushed open the door of the back bedroom slowly. There was a wooden writing desk against the far wall, half hidden by the angle of the door, covered in a dust sheet. He walked to it and lifted the sheet. The desk was dry, intact. On the surface sat a small tin box, dented at one corner. The latch was not locked. Around the box, tied once and left loose, was a faded ribbon, pale blue, the color gone soft with age. On the lid, scratched into the tin in small, uneven letters, two sets of initials. EV and GV. Her grandmother's initials. Her grandfather's. He looked at it. This was the moment. Not the fireplace. Not the border stones. A tin box with two people's initials on it, unguarded, in an empty house, and a man with nothing, alone in a room with it, the latch already undone. He stood there for a long moment without touching it. Then he set the dust sheet back over the desk and covered the box with it. He smoothed the sheet once with the flat of his hand. He took one step back. He turned around. He looked at Cressida standing in the doorway. "Somebody left something in here," he said quietly. "I didn't touch it." Then he walked back toward the front room. She did not move for a minute. She stood in that doorway and looked at the covered desk and felt something move through her chest that she could not name immediately. He had not opened it. He had not even asked what was in it. He had simply understood that it was not his, covered it and walked away. She had been watching for calculation. She had found something else entirely. They ended up on the porch. The cold wind moved through the yard. Arlo sat down on the boards with his back against the wall, travel mug in both hands. "Tell me about this place," he said. She looked at him. "You know more than you're letting on," he said. His voice was even. "The way you moved through it. You've been here before." She sat down beside him. "My grandmother owned it," she said. "She and my grandfather lived here when they were first married. Before the company. He died in the bedroom. She closed the house that same week and never came back." Arlo turned his mug slowly. "She kept it though," he said. "She couldn't let it go." "No." He looked at the border stones in the grass. That makes sense. They sat there for a while. The wind moved through the tall grass. Something creaked inside the house. Why did you bring me here? He asked. She kept looking at the yard. I needed to see something. What? She turned and looked at him. I needed to see what you would do, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and what did I do? You covered the box back up. You didn't open it. You didn't ask what was in it. You just covered it and walked away. Arlo looked at the yard. It's somebody's whole life in there. You don't take from that. You just leave it right. She did not answer. She looked at the border stones and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. They drove back to town in the late morning. She dropped him at May's. He got out, then turned back. Thank you for showing me that place. She nodded. He went inside. She sat in the parking lot longer than she needed to before driving away. That evening she called her mother. Willa Vane had retired to a house outside Lexington and had built her opinion of Cressida's judgment by watching it fail twice already. There is a man, Cressida said. Took a long pause and then asked, how long? For months. And you're only telling me now. I needed to be sure. What does he do? He works at a hardware warehouse. A longer pause. Cressida. Mom. I know what you're going to say. I thought it. Every version. She looked out at the dark Kentucky fields. He is not that. Her mother was silent. Bring him to Sunday dinner, she said finally. Then I'll tell you what I think. Before we go any further, stop and answer something in the comments right now. Have you ever pushed away something good because fear got there first? Tell me. I want to know. Now let us keep going. Here is what happened 3 days after the house. Cressida called Hurston, the company's property manager, to pull land survey records for the Harlan County parcel. A routine request. She made it without thinking. Hurston called back the next morning. I already have it, he said. Arlo Finch came in yesterday asking about the same parcel. She went cold. She sat at her desk and held the phone and felt something inside her chest fall. Property records. He had gone to look at property records. The day after she showed him the house. He calculated it on the drive home. He did the math quietly and went looking for the legal footprint before she had finished deciding she trusted him. She did not call him. She did not reply to his message that evening. She went home, cooked something she did not eat, and sat at her kitchen table until it was too late to talk to anyone. 3 days of silence. On the 4th day he left something at her front office. A folded piece of notebook paper. She opened it at her desk. A hand-drawn map. The outline of the backyard at the old house, the border stones traced carefully. Inside the border, the list. Black-eyed Susan. Echinacea. Yarrow. Wild bergamot. Spiderwort. And at the bottom, one line. Native plants. They would have grown in Kentucky when your grandmother was young. I thought you might want to know what belonged there. Cressida set the paper down on her desk. She had to. Her hands were shaking. He had not been researching the deed. He had been researching the garden. She sat at her desk and did not move for a long time. She picked up the map and read the plant names again. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat against the desk as if she needed something solid. She had built walls to keep greed out and one day found herself using those same walls to keep something honest from getting in. She had not protected herself. She had insulted something clean. Fear had not kept her safe. It had just taught her to wound what was gentle. She picked up the phone. He did not answer. She called again in the evening. It rang through. She drove to Clover Street. She knocked on the door above the laundromat. She heard him inside. Then footsteps. He opened the door. He looked at her. He did not look cold. He looked like a man who had spent 3 days deciding what he was willing to keep absorbing and had not yet finished deciding. I know, she said. I know what I did. He stepped aside to let her in. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out at the street. A paperback on the nightstand with a folded receipt for a bookmark. A jacket on the back of the chair. A pair of boots by the door, the left one resold more recently than the right. This was his life. All of it right here in this room. And she had stood inside it 3 days ago with her silence and her suspicion and her fear, and she had made him feel small inside the only space that was fully his. She sat in the chair. He stood near the window. "I don't know how to do this," he said, "if every time something looks wrong you go quiet and assume the worst. I know what I look like. A broke man with no prospects and a woman whose name is on buildings. I know how that reads." He paused. "I can survive being poor. I've been surviving it. What's harder is being measured. Over and over. Being looked at like the good in you has to be proven on a schedule." He looked at her directly. "That's an old weight, Cressida. I've been carrying it a long time before you." He stopped. He looked out the window. When he turned back his voice was quieter. Not steadier. Quieter in the way a voice gets when it is working harder than it looks. "I sat in this room for 3 days, he said. "I kept thinking about that box. About how I covered it and walked away and thought, maybe that was enough. Maybe she saw it." He exhaled. And then nothing. He did not say anything else for a moment. She did not say it was fine or ask him to forgive her quickly. She said, "You're right." He looked at her. "I became the thing I was afraid of," she said. "I saw suspicion in everything and I put it on you. You deserved better." There was a long silence between them. "I know why you did it," he said. Then, after a moment, "That doesn't mean it didn't cost something." "I know," she said. He looked out the window at the street. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally. "But I need to know that what I carry is taken seriously here. Not just my patience." She looked at him across the small room. "It is," she said. "I'm sorry." He nodded. Not quickly but slowly. Like someone receiving something real rather than performing acceptance. Sunday dinner at Willa Vane's house was not a small thing. Willa was 62, sharp-eyed, and had watched her daughter choose badly twice. She set her table with care and asked questions with the focused intent of a woman protecting something that had already been damaged. Arlo arrived 5 minutes early. He brought a jar of local honey from a farm stand he had passed on the road. Willa looked at it, looked at him, and stepped aside to let him in without comment. At the table, she asked about his background. He answered without hesitation or apology. The farm outside Pikeville. His father. The warehouse. A life he was managing. Not asking to be rescued from. Then Willa set down her fork. "My daughter has money," she said. "A significant amount of it. She has also been chosen before for exactly that reason." The table was very quiet. "So I'm going to ask you plainly. What do you want from her?" Cressida drew breath. Arlo looked at Willa. "I want to sit on a porch with her and have somewhere worth going," he said. "That's it." He did not look away. He did not add anything. Willa maintained eye contact for a long moment. Long enough that Cressida almost spoke. Then something passed across Willa's face that Cressida had not seen there in years. Not approval. Not relief. Something older than both of those. She picked up her fork and looked at her plate and did not say anything for a moment. When she looked up, she looked at Cressida, not at Arlo. Then she began eating again. Later, on the drive back to Harlan, Cressida called her mother. "Well," she said. "Men who are after something blink," Willa said. "Your grandfather never blinked." The pause. "This one doesn't blink." A month after the house, Cressida told him the full truth. At the kitchen table with coffee between them, she told him it was not a company property. It was hers. It had been a test from the beginning. She said she knew it was not honest, and that he had deserved better than that. He looked at his coffee. "I know," he said. She blinked. "You knew." "By the porch," he said. "The way you moved through it. You already knew where everything was. And you stayed." He looked up at her. "Why would I leave?" The pause. "What would have bothered me," he said, "is if you never told me. If you just carried it and let it sit between us." The kitchen was quiet. "That's trust," he said. "What you just did. That's what it looks like." She almost smiled. "No promises," she said. He looked at her. Then he smiled too. In late January he asked if she ever went back to the house. "Not in years," she said. "Places like that need someone to check on them." They drove out on a Saturday. Winter grass flat and pale. The house was the same. Still holding. He walked the perimeter. Checked the foundation. Came back to the porch. The deep structure is sound. It can be fixed. She looked at it for a moment. Would you help me? Yes, he said. They started in the spring. The porch steps. The roof. The windows. Arlo worked weekends. Cressida painted the interior. He asked before he touched anything in the back bedroom. She told him what to keep. He moved through that room slowly. In the backyard, when the border stones were cleared and reset, he planted the 5 from his hand-drawn map. Black-eyed Susan. Echinacea. Yarrow. Wild bergamot. Spiderwort. All native. All belonging. He did not mention it. She found it one Saturday morning and stood at the border for a long time. She had been carrying something for weeks. She stopped waiting for the right moment. I love you, she said. He turned and looked at her. Steady. No performance. I know, he said quietly. I love you too. The summer air moved through the yard. The 5 plants held their ground. 6 months later, on a cold evening, almost exactly 1 year after that first Saturday drive, Arlo asked her to come out to the house. She found his truck in the gravel. He was on the porch. The house was lit from inside. A lamp in the front room. He stood when she came up the steps. I don't have a speech. You know I'm not a speech person. She nodded. He reached into his coat. A small box. Inside, a ring. Simple, clean, a pale stone set low in a plain band. I found the stone at a shop in Pikeville. A man who knew my father set it for me. He looked at her. I want to marry you, Cressida. Not because of what you have. Because of who you are when you think nobody is watching. She thought about the tin box on the desk in the back bedroom. The way he had covered it without opening it, smoothed the sheet once, and walked away. The way he had carried the class wound quietly for years before she ever handed him another one. The way he had stood in that small room on Clover Street and told her the truth about what it cost. She looked at him. Yes, she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. Through the front window, the lamp burned steady against the cold Kentucky dark. Later, after the evening settled cool and quiet over the hills, they sat on the porch together. The lamp still on inside. The yard still. This house saved us, she said. He looked at her. You saved yourself. A long time before you met me. The house just gave you somewhere to look. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about the woman who had driven down this road a year ago, watching his eyes move over the walls, waiting for the calculation to begin. The woman who had found a map on her desk with shaking hands and finally understood what she had almost done. She thought about fear. How it had felt like protection for so long. How it had learned to wear the same face as wisdom. How she had handed it everything it asked for, including, nearly, this. She had spent years building walls to keep greed out. And all along, the abandoned thing was never the house. The lamp burned through the front window. The garden held in the dark. The border stones had been placed by hands that were gone now, and tended by hands that were here, and somewhere in that quiet continuity was the whole shape of what love actually asks of you. Not proof. Not performance. Just the willingness to keep showing up for what was left. She leaned her head against his shoulder and did not move. That was enough. That was everything. My wonderful friends, real love does not announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up quietly and waits to see if you are brave enough to let it stay. What did you think of Cressida and Arlo? Was she right to test him? Was she the one who needed to pass the real test? Tell me in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear from you. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it right now. Share this with someone who needs to believe this kind of love still exists. A new story is coming very soon and you will not want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next one.